All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Isaac, and I want to talk about something a little more abstract today, which is when we make a mistake, how can we handle that? And obviously, in this case, this is in the context of conferences. So if you make a mistake during a presentation, or if you make a mistake organizing a conference, I'm going to be trying to use some of those examples, but the advice here also carries on to everything else when you make a mistake in any other aspect of judging or your general lives. So I'm not going to be talking about specific mistakes, but rather some general concepts around mistakes and how to handle mistakes well. If you do want to learn about some common judge mistakes to avoid, there have been some good articles that have been written on that. I will put those in the Discord chat, but that is not what I'm going to be talking about. If you have any questions or comments, please do put them in the chat. I like it when my presentations are more of a dialogue than just a lecture. So I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on anything that I say, or if you have any relevant examples, please do mention those in the chat. Similarly, if you have any feedback, as Kevin talked about, feedback is awesome. I would love to hear your feedback on this presentation. So please do take notes and put that in the feedback form. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to go through four things. First, I'm going to talk about what does it mean to make a mistake? Namely, how can we tell if a certain decision was a mistake or not a mistake? Then we're going to talk about how to handle mistakes when they do happen. Then we're going to talk about how to avoid mistakes in the future. And lastly, we are going to talk about what I'm calling a mistakes culture. How do we help both ourselves and other people improve themselves in this area, improve themselves at these other three skills? So, first, what is a mistake? This word actually refers to two different concepts, and I think it's really important to distinguish these concepts. And I'll illustrate this with an example. So let's say that you're playing a game of Legacy and you cast Predict. Your opponent is playing Burn. What would be a good card to name, do you think? Just let me know your thoughts in the chat. What would you name in this situation? Assuming you didn't know anything else about your opponent's deck other than that they're playing Burn. Lightning Bolt? Okay. Any other ideas? Mountain. Yeah, I think Mountain's probably going to be better. There are probably more than four mountains in the deck. So yeah. So you name Mountain, and you mill a card, and turns out, sorry, they mill a card, not you, and turns out it was in fact Lightning Bolt. Now, my question to you is: was it a mistake to name Mountain because you did not get the named card? You did not draw two cards. Right. Yeah, you just played the odds and lost. So, in a sense, you were mistaken in your guess of what the top card of the library was, but your decision was not a mistake. You made, in fact, the best decision that you could at the time. A theoretical perfect Magic player who never made mistakes would have made the same decision. So, it was not a mistake to name Mountain, even though it ended up having a bad outcome. You made the best choice that you could have made, taking into account the information you had at the time. And this is a really important distinction to keep in mind because as judges, sometimes something will go wrong at a tournament or in a presentation or at a conference. And possibly you just haven't done anything wrong. Maybe Discord servers crash that day, or maybe your headphones just choose that day to break. And this isn't necessarily your fault. Now, I mean, if they're 10-year-old headphones that you haven't maintained, maybe that's your fault. But usually, a situation like that might not actually be your fault. Our universe is, very subject to random chance, and by its very nature, that is unforeseeable. I guess replace headphones rather than maintain them. So this is the first potential mistake that I'll mention. Just because there's a choice that you could have made that would have prevented a problem doesn't mean the choice was actually a mistake. You don't want to blame yourself or others for something that they couldn't have foreseen. This is known as hindsight bias or outcome bias. There's slightly different things, but they're the same basic concept. We want to evaluate our decisions based on whether they made sense in the situation we were in at the time, not based on additional knowledge we've gained afterwards that we couldn't have gained at the time. There are a couple good articles about this that I am also going to mention in the chat. I have posted links to them. Now, unfortunately, it is possible to take this mentality too far and start using it as an excuse to dismiss actual mistakes as, well, this couldn't have been predicted, so I did nothing wrong. And that's also a problem. We don't want to do that. So, how do we distinguish between the two? How can we tell if something was a mistake or if they just fell victim to an unexpected occurrence that they had no way to predict? Well, first off, as with most cognitive biases, simply knowing that it exists doesn't make us immune. So we need to actually look at the evidence, try and get information from other people, and figure out what we should do. And there are some things we can do. So we can think about other things that could have happened but didn't and how likely those were. So take something like my headphones failing. Well, I could tell myself, oh, I should have known. I've had them for a while. They were cheap headphones. Really, I should have known that this could happen. This is my fault. Or maybe I could do the opposite. I could tell myself, well, I see that wire's sticking out, and I know they kind of stopped working for a few minutes last conference, but there's really no way I could have known that this was going to happen. So compare that to a different occurrence that could have happened. So maybe instead of my headphones not working, maybe that is the other thing I mentioned, Discord crashing, or something else like that. Maybe if it's an in-person conference, the projector fails or someone forgets to bring it. I don't know. Ask yourself, is this of a similar likelihood to what actually happened? And if so, would it have been reasonable to predict that other thing or to make plans for that other thing or to notice that it was going to happen? Take something in the similar situation. Basically, it's called the reference class of actions. Look at other items in that reference class and think about whether it would have been reasonable to know about those. Another thing we can do is we can consider how somebody else would have acted. So if I'm not sure whether I made a mistake or not, take somebody who I know is a really good judge and generally does a really good job at something like this. So if it's a trivia game, Joe Klopchek generally does a really good job. So if I run a trivia game and something bad happens, I ask myself, okay, well, would this have happened to Joe? Is this something that Joe would have known to avoid and been able to avoid, or is this something that could have happened to Joe? And that can tell me whether I made a mistake or not, whether I actually failed at something important, or if this was just kind of random happenstance. We also want to focus on the information that was available at the time. So don't obsess over something that you could have found out. Like, sure, maybe I could have investigated and found out about this fact that would have told me that this thing wouldn't have happened. But at the time, why would you have known to do that? So you want to focus on what information was available at the time. If there was information that reasonably could have led you to a conclusion, like noticing that your headphones were falling apart, then yeah, you should take that into account. But if there is no way you could have found out about that without, I don't know, taking your headphones to the headphone repair shop and having them looked over, paying $100 for it, then no, that's not a reasonable expectation, even if technically maybe you could have found that out in advance. And that's kind of just what leads into the fourth bullet point there. Look, I'm improvising, okay? Headphone repair shop. I'm sure one exists somewhere. And this is what the fourth bullet point really is touching on there. Just think about whether there was a good reason to believe this could happen. Don't focus on whether you could have noticed. Think about should you have noticed. Think about were there things that were hinting you towards this thing. Has this happened before, right? Have you seen someone else encounter this issue before? Have you been made aware of the potential of this issue and you chose not to do anything about it? Consider that sort of thing. Okay. Any questions about identifying mistakes and telling whether or not something is a mistake before I move on to the next section? Does anyone have any thoughts about this or any comments? No? Okay, I will move on. If you think of something later, feel free to mention it. Okay, so section 2 is making mistakes. It's going to happen. What should we do when we have made that mistake? The first thing to do is generally to apologize. This is the least important step, but it's still important to show remorse and acknowledge that you have made an error. When you're apologizing, don't make excuses, don't try and explain yourself. Now, thinking about what caused you to make that mistake is indeed very important. It's another step that we're going to talk about later, and you are going to want to do that and maybe talk it over with people, but you don't want to include it as part of the apology because it's going to be perceived as you just making excuses. So, a personal example here, my first Grand Prix, the one first Grand Prix I ever went to, I misread the schedule and I was late to my shift. And my team lead came to me and started giving me this feedback that I should not be late to my shift. And, I agreed. This is good feedback. I should have done a better job there. But there was the reason for this was basically that the schedule was poorly written. My shift starting time was kind of hidden off in the corner and it was different from what it was yesterday. So the schedule could have been better. And I tried to explain this to my team lead, but they took this as me being defensive. They took it as me trying to shift blame from my mistake. And that was my mistake. I shouldn't have done that. Now, I did have good feedback, right? What I was saying about the schedule was correct. It could have been better. But me including it immediately right after I was told that I made a mistake, it comes off like I am trying to shift blame. So you don't want to do that. You want to say first, I am sorry for that. And then only later you can come up to that person. You can say, hey, here's something that I think you could have done better that might have helped prevent this from happening. You want to separate those into separate interactions so that it doesn't seem like defensiveness. When it comes to situations like this, I mean, the thing that I like to remember is that there's a difference between wanting to look good versus wanting to be good. Trying to hide your mistake or trying to minimize it, that's a natural reaction that we're all going to have. You want to come off like you didn't make a mistake. You want to look at other people, but that's different from wanting to be a good judge, right? Good judges want to be able to learn from their mistakes, and minimizing them is in opposition to that goal. So we want to internalize this idea that our goal is not to look good to other people, our goal is to actually be good, and we want to focus on that. And then on top of that, people also often are going to notice it when you try and avoid admitting responsibility for a mistake. So, for example, a while ago, I saw a judge ask in a rules chat, and they had some rules question. They said, I think it was about like some ability that targeted and had some other effect, like bounce target creature and draw a card. And they said, if the target creature goes away, do you still get the card draw? And they said, I'm pretty sure that you do, since they're separate sentences. And other people in the chat explained to them that no, that's not actually how it works. It's all one ability. So without a target, it's going to fizzle. You're not going to draw a card. And the judge who had asked at the end said, "Oh, okay, that's what I thought. I was just asking to confirm." Right. I'm sure that most people there noticed that that's not actually what happened. They were just trying to come off as more knowledgeable than they were, and this, of course, backfired. Right now, they look in it like in addition to not knowing this rule, which honestly is not a big deal. Right, not knowing a rule is something that applies to all of us. That's not a big deal. But now, on top of that, they've made it look like they were trying to hide their mistake by misrepresenting what they actually thought, and that made them come off way worse. So you want to avoid the instinct to do that because often it's just not going to work. Yeah, as Kevin mentions, different people are going to have different reactions to making a mistake. And for some of us, it comes much more naturally to say, okay, yeah, I made a mistake. Let's figure out how to prevent this from happening next time. And that can come off to other people as making excuses because maybe other people want to focus more on taking responsibility and saying, yeah, this was on me. This is my fault. And the solutions kind of come after that. And different people are going to have different approaches there. And there is another article that I will post. This is a lot of articles. You don't have to read them all, but they are good, so I would recommend them. This talks about why it can be hard to admit our mistakes, and it's a really good, well researched article. Okay, so after apologizing, step 2 is to fix it. We want to fix the mistake. In order to do this well, we want to figure out how urgent the issue is. So if you've just given a wrong ruling in a game, that probably needs to take precedence over anything else. You want to go back immediately, tell the players to pause, and figure out how best to fix this, which is going to be, getting the head judge, letting them know what happened, figuring out what you can do from there. On the other hand, if you know that the match has ended, then the time frame is a little more relaxed. You should probably still let the players know before the next round begins so that they know what the correct ruling is. But it's a little more relaxed, but sooner is still better than later. For something like an error in a presentation, right? If I have a rules presentation and I say something incorrect, in that case, I want to let people know probably before the presentation ends. Maybe I could post about it in the forums afterwards, but you don't want to wait too long. It doesn't have to be right afterwards, but you want to consider, how urgent is this? If I don't fix it right now, is it going to compound? Is it going to become worse? We also want to make sure that we contact everybody who's been affected. It's very easy to talk to some of the people who have been affected and think that we've fixed the problem when in reality we haven't. For example, if there's a judge who was shadowing me while I made an incorrect ruling, and then they let me know about it afterwards. Or sorry, excuse me. If there's a judge who's shadowing me while I made an incorrect ruling and I notice it afterwards, or somebody else brings it up to me, I need to talk to the players and fix the problems in their game and inform them of how it actually works. But then I also need to find that shadowing judge to make sure that they know that my ruling was wrong and don't take this as an example of how to make rulings. A mistake is generally not fixed until everybody involved has been made aware. And this is really important because mistakes can have a ripple effect. If I, say if I'm giving a presentation on replacement effects and I say something incorrect, well, now there are, 10 to 100 attendees who have all been given this incorrect information. And if I don't correct it in all of their minds, like if I don't let all of them know that this is not correct, then they're going to go on and potentially teach that on to other people. So mistakes can kind of spiral out of control, and we really want to make sure we are cutting them off at the head and addressing everybody who might have been impacted. Okay. Lastly, we want to figure out how to avoid making that type of mistake in the future. We don't just want to say, okay, mistake fixed, moving on. We want to sit down, think about it, figure out how do we have this not happen again. And this is really the most important and the most involved aspect of dealing with mistakes. So I'm going to talk about it in a little more depth, and we have a section for that. Before I move on, does anybody have any questions or comments on fixing mistakes when they happen? Toby mentions, I agree analyzing and fixing mistakes can be important, but never letting someone's mistake fade away seems like it can be no good. Yeah, absolutely. So we don't want to obsess over mistakes. If I make a mistake and I figure out what caused it and I now adjust my behavior for the future, I don't need to keep thinking about that mistake over and over. We want to learn our lessons from the mistake and then let it go at that point. We definitely don't want to keep obsessing over it for years. You don't want to do that. Okay, so avoiding mistakes. The first question here is, should we actually try to avoid mistakes at all? Because after all, we hear all sorts of sayings like, it's great to make mistakes, that's how you learn. And I'd like to challenge this statement a bit. We do certainly need to be able to accept our mistakes and live with them, but I wouldn't say it's good to make them in the first place. You can learn a lot from making a mistake, but you can also learn a lot in ways that do not involve making a mistake first. And when that's possible, it's much better to learn the lesson without messing something up in the process. Going too far into the mistakes are going to happen mindset can give us an excuse to not prepare sufficiently for a challenging role or a challenging responsibility that we're taking on. We might then end up overwhelmed by things that we could have been ready for if we had instead chosen to prepare sufficiently to avoid those mistakes. So we should be proactively looking for ways to avoid mistakes whenever possible. So, what I would say instead is that we should strive to find ways of learning and improving that do not involve making mistakes in the first place, or at least not mistakes that affect other people. As a quick example of this, there are mock tournaments where you have basically a fake tournament designed to let judges take rulings and get practice. And that's a great example of how learning from mistakes can be really good because judges are going to make mistakes in their rulings at mock tournaments. That's kind of the point. But those mistakes are not going to hurt anybody because there aren't real players in the event. There are other judges who are participating in that event in order to give that educational experience to the judges taking calls. Those mistakes aren't going to hurt anybody. They're not going to damage anything, so that's okay. That is the good type of learning from mistakes. When mistakes do happen in a real life scenario, which they are going to, we should accept them and learn how to deal with them and take the lessons that we can from them. But learning from our mistakes should always be plan B. Or as Jace puts it, it's good to learn from your failures, but I prefer to learn from the failures of others. So, what can we do to avoid making mistakes? When you're about to do something like make a ruling, we want to get into the habit of thinking about how confident of the answer are we. Now, of course, it's never possible to be 100% certain of anything, and we want to think realistically about how likely we are to be wrong. So we want to consider things like is there time pressure? How easy is it going to be for me to find more evidence? So if I've been asked a rules question and I can look it up in 5 seconds, I should probably do that, even if I'm like 95% sure already. There's a very low cost to looking it up. On the other hand, if this is some complicated policy question and the only way for me to get more information would be to email Wizards of the Coast and ask them how they want this to work, well, that's not really going to work in a live situation. So even if I'm a little less confident, I should go ahead and make the ruling. For something like a presentation, if a attendee asks me a question, I want to consider, you know, is this a question that I can confidently answer and confidently say that, I'm not making a mistake here? If not, can I just look it up right now? I mean, that's one thing that I'll do if I'm giving a rules presentation, because I think that's also just great practice for the attendees. Is if I don't know the answer to a rules question, I'll just exit out of the presentation, pull up the comp rules, and I will show people how you find an answer to a question in the rules that you don't know. Right? Can we do that? That's generally pretty easy. It has additional benefits, right? So consider these things before giving the answer. You don't just want to run on autopilot. You don't just want to like answer questions habitually without letting your like deliberative mind think it over, because that's how you make very consistent mistakes without even thinking about it. Time pressure is something you have to be really careful of. Often, if you feel pressured into giving an answer quickly, you're much more likely to make a mistake. So, one thing that I've started doing is I've started keeping track of all of the rules questions that I answer and all the policy questions that I answer and how many I get correct versus incorrect. And I noticed that I tended to get a lot more incorrect when I was answering them online, because online there's kind of subtle pressure to answer before anybody else does. Or if it's like an SOS channel, I want to answer, right away so that the other judge can get their answer. So there's just that kind of unconscious pressure of like, you have to answer this right now. You have to answer this right now. Whereas for in-person rulings at an event, I'm in charge of that ruling. I know that I can issue a time extension. Nobody's pressing me to answer right away. So my error rate there was a little lower. And so I was able to notice this since I was keeping track of these numbers. And then I could notice that, okay, I clearly need to take a step back when I'm answering questions online, stop feeling rushed into it, take a moment to think it over, look things up if I need to, make sure I'm not missing anything. As an example of the kind of autopilot thing, there was a mistake I made a long time ago. A player had asked me a rules question. It was some weird corner case about like casting a spell from the top of your library and whether you could look at the card beneath it, I think. And at the time, I couldn't remember whether the rules actually included an answer to this. Like it felt to me like one of the questions that the comprehensive rules just kind of didn't cover, because it was in one of those like corners that they don't really try and cover. And so I answered the question based on that. Basically, I said, here's what the rules do say, so we're gonna, work according to those. And then afterwards, I thought to myself, well, hold on, shouldn't I just check just to be sure? Like it's very easy to check. And so I did. I pulled up the section, and I discovered that in fact there was a rule to cover that, and it made my ruling incorrect. So I had to go back to the players. I had to apologize and explain what happened. And in this case, I failed to consider the difficulty of finding more evidence. I just assumed that if I couldn't remember there being a rule for it, that rule probably didn't exist, which is a heuristic that works for me most of the time. But there was no good reason to use it here, because it was very easy to check and see if that rule actually did exist. Yeah, Martha has posted a great article about a Grand Prix head judge who made a mistake and wrote an article about it. I would suggest people check it out. It's a good article. So, after we have made a mistake, there are a number of things that we can do to focus on not making it again. So, talking it over with someone else is a really good step because, you know, if I'm the person who made a mistake in the first place, clearly there was some flaw in what I did. So, I shouldn't 100% trust myself to know what that flaw is because I'm the one who has that flaw in the first place, right? That this is the importance of external feedback. If I can talk it over with somebody else, get their perspective on what they would have done to avoid this mistake or what they think I could have done, that's going to be really valuable. I can find out how common a mistake it is, right? If I'm a newer judge and I made this mistake and I feel like it's the end of the world, and then I talk to a more experienced judge and they say, "Oh yeah, this happens all the time. It's really not a big deal. Maybe we even have this system set up to mitigate these types of mistakes." Finding that out can be really useful. We want to take actionable steps, not just resolve to not make the mistake again. This is itself a mistake that I see people make from time to time where people say, "Oh, that was horrible. I'm going to do a better job next time. I'm going to not do that." And sure, this is a great idea. Like, I agree, big fan, not making mistakes again. But just, strongly resolving to not do it again doesn't mean that that's not going to happen. So if you made a rules mistake and then you just commit, okay, I'm going to be better next time. I'm going to give a correct answer next time. But you don't do anything towards that goal. You don't spend more time learning the rules. You don't try some practice questions. You don't talk to a mentor. Like, if you're not doing anything, it's unlikely that your resolution is actually going to have any effect. So you want to make sure that you're actually taking actionable, direct steps that address what happened and prevent it from happening in the future. We want to focus on the root cause of the mistake, not superficial ones. We want to be asking, well, why did this happen? And why did that happen? And what's the appropriate level of this hierarchy to intervene and try and change things? Because sometimes you might just end up addressing a symptom of the mistake rather than the underlying issue. So, for example, let me pick on Judge Academy little bit. So a while back, Judge Academy released a new website update, and there was a problem with it. And the problem was that when people were logging in on their phones, there was no login button, and they just couldn't log in. So let me ask you a question, and obviously, none of us know exactly why this happened, but just as a theoretical example, why do we think that something like this might have happened? What could lead to this mistake? Tell me your thoughts. And just the first thing that comes into your head. It doesn't have to be correct. You don't have to know anything about web design. Just talking about it in a very general sense. Lack of checking the website on mobile. Yeah. So before it goes live, have somebody check it over and take a look at it. Yeah. Anything else? Because anytime we have something that happened and causes for it, there are always going to be many different causes. There's going to be kind of a chain of cause to effect, and you can go up and down and across. There are going to be all sorts of different things. Really? Nobody? All right. So, I mean, in this case, lack of checking the website on mobile could be definitely a cause of this thing, right? I mean, the immediate cause is somebody forgot to program that in, right? And if the solution is just, oh, we'll add the login button, sure, that fixes this problem, but does that fix the underlying issue, or does that fix a symptom of the issue? Right, because it's probably just going to happen again. So yeah, having someone check it over, that could have helped. But why didn't they do that? Right, I don't know. Maybe they couldn't afford to pay someone for it. Maybe they just didn't think of it. Maybe because they don't have anybody who is has experience with web design. Maybe they just didn't realize this was important. I mean, I don't know. But these are the sorts of things that you want to be considering when you're making a mistake. You don't just want to immediately, say, okay, well, this thing went bad, so I'm just going to change this one thing. Okay, done. Like, consider, is the same cause going to lead to the same thing again? So, I mean, as a different example, I was in a Discord server once where one of their bots wasn't working. It was supposed to assign me a role when I typed a command, and it didn't do that. And I reported this to the admins, and the admin said, "Oh, sorry about that. I have given you the role manually. It's fixed." And my response was, "Well, no. Like, you haven't actually fixed the bot. Like presumably this is going to happen again. And in fact, I tested it again, and it did in fact happen again. Like they did not address the underlying issue. They just addressed a symptom of the underlying issue. And that's something that is going to be really compelling because it's often the easiest fix. And sometimes it will be necessary to kind of paper over the issue for the meantime, right? Maybe you can't fix your Discord bot right away. And so manual role assignment is the best you can do in the meantime, since you need people to have the correct roles. But you always want to come back to that root cause later and make sure that you actually put a stop to the actual problem and not just a symptom. I'll give one more example of this, which is I had a person on Facebook, and as people on Facebook do, they made a lot of posts. They would share posts that they saw and they liked, and some of their posts would be incorrect. And they had told me at one time, like, hey, if you ever see, I want to be sharing correct things. So if you ever see me sharing a post that's false, like it's using wrong statistics or is just wrong, please let me know. I care. I want to, be sharing correct posts. And I said, okay, that's great. I really appreciate that. And so they shared a post, and it was wrong. And I let them know about this, and they said, okay, I've deleted the post. And this happened. Something similar happened a couple times, and eventually it became clear that sure, maybe they're willing to change a post or delete it when it seems incorrect, but they're not addressing the underlying issue of confirmation bias. Like they're just sharing the things that seem convenient to them. They're not checking to see if it's true before sharing it. And so eventually I just gave up. Like this person, I don't think that they were going to address the underlying issue here. And it was not, I don't want to be here sitting, addressing these kind of duct tape symptomatic fixes over and over and over, right? So we always want to be considering the root cause, just like how the IPD tells us, different mistakes stem from the same root cause, have the same, you only issue one penalty. Well, here again, we want to be considering the root cause of the mistake. Okay, so as Toby mentioned earlier, obsessing over mistakes is a thing that humans tend to do, and we can't get away from that. But we can try and direct that energy towards a more productive approach. So rather than obsessing over past mistakes, obsess over future ones instead. Basically, if I find myself thinking, I did this really stupid thing, I can't believe that was so embarrassing. What I do instead is I change it. I take that embarrassment and I say, okay, I want this to never happen again because that was so embarrassing. How can I ensure absolutely that this cannot happen again? And I obsess over that instead. You want to direct that energy into a more productive activity. And that's not going to just solve the problem, obviously. Like if you're somebody who has trouble repeatedly obsessing over past mistakes, like this isn't just a quick fix, but it is something that can potentially help because it both takes your energy away from that sort of self-destructive obsession and move it towards something more productive. And then it also is better. It does help you avoid mistakes, whereas just obsessing over past ones, that doesn't really help you not make mistakes in the future. And then lastly, just keep track of how often you're making the same type of mistake. If you make a mistake once, that's usually not a big deal. But if you're making the same mistake over and over, that indicates that there is a failure in this process, and perhaps because there is a root cause that you did not address. You were just addressing symptoms. So making multiple similar mistakes is a sign that you are not doing something right, and you need to change what you are doing on a more fundamental level. Judge Academy has a nice course about when mistakes happen. I will post a link to that in the Discord chat. Okay. Before I move on to our last section, are there any questions about this or any comments about avoiding mistakes? Any thoughts? Anybody have a mistake that you want to share and tell us, what you did to not make that mistake again? Any lessons you learned? I see some people typing, so I'm just giving them a moment. Yeah, so Toby mentions that she was worried about giving time warnings on time for her conference yesterday, so she set an alarm. Yeah, don't rely on your memory. If you know your memory is faulty, which for basically everybody it is, you know, rely on something that is more reliable than your memory. Yeah, Martha mentions running a conference and a presenter had to cancel at the last minute. They used email, which you didn't check that morning. So, what is it that you changed from there? Because I can think of a couple things to change. I could think of, well, check email the morning of the conference. That's one approach. I could think of telling presenters, giving them a channel in which to contact me. I could say, I check Discord most often. Please contact me via Discord, or please contact me via Facebook. I could, communicate that to them. I could have a backup presenter, so that a presenter canceling last minute is not that big a deal. Uh, yeah, specify how to reach me. Yeah, I know I've kind of had the inverse problem where I just assumed for a conference I was running, I just kind of assumed that all my presenters would check Discord and see all my messages there, and it turned out that they did not, and I needed to email them, and that was, I didn't communicate with them, and so now I know going forward that I cannot just assume that all my presenters are going to check Discord, and I should talk with them about how I can reach them with information that they need to know. Okay, so lastly, creating a healthy mistakes culture. How do we cultivate a positive environment around mistakes uh, in the judge program? So, in general society, especially in many professional contexts, which judging tends to be similar to, an admission of error is seen as a sign of weakness. It puts us at risk of getting made fun of losing the respect of our peers, or even of getting fired if it's a job. As a result, people often hide their mistakes and bluff their way through things rather than be honest about their failings and their gaps in knowledge. And this is not conducive to our emotional well being nor to our self improvement. We want to, as judges, we want to reverse the normal system and make it so that public admission of mistakes or saying, I don't know, is seen as a sign of honesty, as a sign of self confidence, and as a desire to do better next time. Basically, we want that to be a positive status symbol instead of a negative one. And this is doable, but it's hard because it's a matter of changing social norms within the judge program. The traditional societal values of seeing mistakes as bad are always going to be creeping in from the outside, and keeping that mindset from taking over requires an active effort from those of us within the judge community. And so there are some things that we can do in particular to reinforce this culture. The most important of which is just talking about our mistakes. There are many, many reasons why talking about our mistakes, ideally publicly, but even privately with friends, has many, many benefits. First off, as we talked about, it lets us get other perspectives and advice on how to avoid that mistake. It can help us accept our mistake and learn to be honest with ourselves. Talking it over with somebody. If I'm obsessing over it, I'm like, oh, this is horrible. And then I talk to somebody, and they can, kind of comfort me and say, oh, it's not that big a deal. I did the same thing when I was getting started, right? If an inexperienced judge makes a mistake and they talk to a level 3 Grand Prix head judge and that person tells them, oh yeah, I made the same mistake, right? That can be really comforting to them to know that even the most experienced judges have done things like that and they still got to where they are. But then from a societal standpoint, there are also many other benefits here. It lets others learn from our mistakes. As we talked about, there's no reason to force everybody to make the same mistake themselves when instead everybody could learn from just one person having made that mistake and avoid that themselves. It helps other people feel less bad about their own mistakes, right? If I see a level 3 Grand Prix head judge say, "Oh yeah, I got this ruling wrong," right? That helps me feel a lot less bad about the rulings that I get wrong. It helps it's going to help me feel less embarrassed. It's going to help me feel less insecure. It's going to make me more willing to talk about my mistake. Again, there's kind of that ripple effect of just if a community leader is providing this good example and helping other people be more comfortable doing that, then they can set that example to their friends and their peers, and it really can have a really strong effect. And it also just makes you more approachable, right? Especially if you're a more experienced judge, people can be intimidated by you. People can see your name on a lot of important stuff. They can see that you've been around for 15, 20 years. They can see that you're in charge of 1,000-player tournaments or 100-player tournaments, depending on what you want to consider big. And they can be, worried about approaching you because, if you do something wrong, maybe they're going to think badly of you. And so seeing the people that you respect talk about their mistakes makes them much more approachable. You're going to be much more willing to talk to them. So don't only bring up your mistakes when you have to. It shouldn't be a last resort. It shouldn't be something that is forced upon you. You should want to talk about them for these benefits, right? Go out of your way to bring up your mistakes and what you learned from them. You want to lead by example and show the people who look up to you that it's okay to be honest about their mistakes, that it won't make people think any less of them. If you see somebody make a mistake in public, praise them. Say, hey, I'm really happy you said this. This taught me something. I'm really glad to see people talking about this. Because another thing is, other people are very unlikely to remember your mistakes. You're not the main character in their lives. You're going to remember your own mistakes. You're not really going to remember other people's mistakes, but you will remember that somebody else was humble and honest about your mistakes, and they will remember that about you. And that's going to color positively your relationship with them and with the community. Other things that we wanted to is don't gossip about other people's mistakes, but neither should you be unwilling to discuss them when relevant. So when we, gossip about somebody else's mistake in an effort to make them look bad, that is undermining them if it ever gets back to them. But more importantly, it also just reinforces this norm that mistakes are bad, right? If there is somebody I don't like and I see them make a mistake and I go to one of my friends and I say, wow, look, that person just did this thing horribly. What a terrible judge, right? Even setting aside any negative effects it has for them, well, it reinforces between my friend and myself that mistakes are bad. And that if I make a mistake, my enemies are going to talk about it. So that's exactly the opposite of what we want to do. We don't want to be reinforcing that. We want to be saying that, mistakes are okay. Even if it's somebody that we don't like, you know, the reason we don't like them should not be just because of one mistake. That's not a good reason to dislike somebody. We do want to be willing to discuss them when they're relevant. So, kind of the flip side of this is we don't want to just pretend that nobody ever makes a mistake. We don't want to try and hide other people's mistakes when it's relevant. So, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, Isaac, I saw you had this presenter on your conference last month and they wanted to present at my conference, do you have any thoughts? Well, if that presenter, made some mistakes at my conference that I think might be relevant, yeah, I'm going to mention that. I'm going to mention it privately. I'm not going to make fun of them for it, but it is important, and we do want to have a culture where we can discuss that, right? It should be okay to talk about mistakes, primarily our own mistakes, but also other people's mistakes when that is relevant. We want to be able to do that. And if somebody tells you that you made a mistake, please listen to them. This is in general just kind of accepting feedback, even if it's somebody that you're not friends with. uh, they are not telling you something that they believe to be wrong. They think they are giving you the truth. And so even if you disagree, their perspective is still going to be valuable. Even if you don't think you made a mistake, what is true is that you did something that made somebody else think you made a mistake. And so you can still consider how to avoid that perception, even if you don't think you made a mistake. But very, very often you did, in fact, made a mistake. Somebody else might have noticed something. It might be a very small mistake. It might not be as relevant as they're making it out to be. But usually, if somebody else is bringing something like that up to you, there is going to be something that you could have done better there. Uh, Culture around mistakes and feedback is something that I am passionate about. And lately, I've been working on putting together a project for judges who are also passionate about this sort of thing. It's not quite finished yet. I haven't worked out all the details. I haven't announced it. But if you would be interested in joining and kind of seeing a rough draft of it and telling me your thoughts, I would be interested in that. And you might also find some of the things that we talk about there interesting. Right now, it's a Discord server. I just posted a link to the Discord server in the chat. So feel free to join if you would like. No requirements, of course. So to sum up, just because something bad happened doesn't mean that somebody made a mistake. We want to consider the information that they had at the time to consider whether they made a mistake, not just what ended up happening as a result. When a mistake happens, we want to apologize and then we want to fix it for everybody. Make sure that nobody is going to be adversely impacted by your mistake. We want to think things through before acting. We want to get into that habit of not acting instinctually. We want to think things through and come to a reasoned decision and get out of that kind of mental habit model where you just one thing happens and you just immediately respond with this thing. Try and consider it first. Take into account your confidence level, take into account how easy it would be to look into this more, before saying what you're about to say or doing what you're about to do. After making a mistake, we want to figure out what caused it. We want to come up with an actionable system to prevent it from occurring again. Don't just resolve not to do it, figure out how you are actually going to implement that. And then we should be open about our mistakes. We should try to use them as teaching examples. We should try to use them as funny stories. We should not act embarrassed about our mistakes. Don't try and hide them. Try and show other people that it is okay to be accepting of mistakes and it is okay for them to do the same thing. So, thank you for coming to this presentation. If you think that any part of this presentation was a mistake, please put that in the feedback form. I do look at all the feedback I get. I really appreciate it. I would be interested in knowing what you think of this presentation. Thank you.